Okay, parents, your kids are going to turn out just fine.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by FOCO. That's FOCO, F-O-C-O. If you are a parent of a child or teen with ADHD, you know how challenging it can be to keep them focused and engaged. FOCO is the all-natural solution for ADHD, whether it's for school, homework, or just everyday activities. FOCO helps your child or teen stay calm and attentive. Before trying prescription drugs like Adderall that can come with harsh side effects, I recommend you try FOCO. Visit ThinkFOCO, that's ThinkFoco, thinkfoco.com for more information. Welcome to the Your Kids Will Be Fine podcast. I am Dr. Michael Malopsky, board-certified pediatrician and parent of 7. On Your Kids Will Be Fine, we're here to help parents sift through all of the information overload that comes with the information age of parenting and help parents understand what decisions are really important, what to focus on, and what things may not be as important to try and limit information overload and help maybe decrease our anxiety about the parenting choices that we make and help you understand that your kids will be fine. And as always, we can be found on all podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get podcasts. Also find us on yourkidswillbefine.com. We're going to continue our Ages and Stages series on the podcast. You can go back to the last 2 episodes that we recorded focusing on infancy, newborns and infants. And now we're going to focus on infancy from about 2 to 12 months, and this is going to be part 1. So let's talk about when you go to your pediatrician and the visits are as anyone who's been a parent for a while knows that you go at 2 months and 4 months and 6 months and 9 months and 12 months. And those visits are structured around assessing your overall infant's well-being. We measure their growth, and we spend a lot of time talking about development and developmental milestones. And every parenting website, every parenting resource that you look at, you're going to be shown lists of ages and stages and help you understand what are the touch points, what are the important elements of your child's developmental progress. And I think that these can be helpful, and they're really good ways to measure your child's neurocognitive progress, but they can also be a bit anxiety-provoking because not every child develops at the same rate, at the same pace, and not every child shows up at every visit doing exactly the same things. So I want to share a little bit about what's the most important thing to understand about your child's development. And remember that your pediatrician who's been seeing you knows your child as very well and is the best resource to help you understand, is there something here to worry about or is there a problem? But we roughly divide development into multiple streams, as it were, or areas that we focus on. We look at social and emotional development, we look at fine motor, we look at gross motor, we look at adaptive or social adaptive, we look at expressive and receptive skills, and that's kind of, we assess all those things in a big picture way to look at your child's overall developmental progress. The thing to note is not every child develops in the same rate in every area. I'll give you an example: gross motor skills, like walking. It is normal for children to walk independently anywhere between 12 months and up to 18 months. And perfectly normal, healthy children, and even in my own home with 7 kids, walking showed up very differently. We had 9-month walkers and we had an 18-month walker. And they're all fine. They're all grown up and they're all fine. And you can't tell them apart. And a lot of areas of development move that way. The most important areas that really predict developmental outcome, meaning is your child's developmental outcome going to be normal, are much more the social milestones, as well as the verbal milestones, which also occur on a continuum. The social milestones are the things like at 2 months, is your child looking at you? Is your child smiling at you? Is your child obviously acknowledging the fact that you're there and is excited and happy to see you? And at 4 months, does that turn into engagement and showing real pleasure at your presence? even laughing and making more sounds, which then evolves from 6 months into 9 months with playing games and interacting and enjoying engagement. Those milestones are way more predictive of long-term developmental outcome than whether your child is rolling at exactly the right time or sitting independently at exactly the right time, because those can be more variable, or standing up and walking. As we talked about, the gross motor skills are less predictive. So the big picture is that every child in their developmental progress in all these areas will all show up sometimes at different times and different speeds and different trajectories in every child. And it's important for your pediatrician and you to discuss the bigger picture to recognize, is this representative of a concern, or is this just my child's individual normal developmental progress that may not look exactly like it is on time in the textbooks, but is completely normal for them. So that's the most important big picture take home message I want people to understand about their child's developmental milestones. And it's good to look them up. It's good to read about them. It's good to understand them, but it's good to bring them to your pediatrician to get a bigger picture perspective from someone who sees children all day to help you recognize if what my child is doing is normal. Second, let's talk about the two areas that I believe for most parents, especially new parents, if it's your first child, that create, I think, the most questions and I think anxiety are things around eating and sleeping. So let's first talk about sleep training. Many of us, if you have kids, have been probably given or introduced to books such as Happiest Baby on the Block or Baby Wise, all these things about getting your baby to be on a schedule and doing things in a predictable way as early as possible. And there's no question that the biggest disruption and change in new parents' lives is the adjustment of sleep, because there was no other time in your adult life until you have a new baby that you really are chronically sleep deprived over the long term. There's nothing else that does that to you, unless maybe you've been a resident in a medical specialty. So, so first, let's talk about sleep and sleep training. A lot of people come to me in the first month and they're very distressed, the first month or two, because they've read Baby Wise, they've read Happiest Baby on the Block, they've done all the things that those books say to do, and their child still simply doesn't seem to pick it up. Their child just doesn't respond to it. And they think that something is wrong with them, or they think that something is wrong with their baby. And that is simply not true. A lot of what determines how babies function in the first 2 to 3 months around their sleep routine is about their personality and temperament. Some babies are just very, very organized. They are very relaxed. They're not overly sensitive to either external or internal things that stimulate them or rattle them. And so they very easily and naturally fall into a very predictable routine. That is very personality and temperamentally driven, meaning your child came out with that software installed and this is just emerging. Some babies are not like that. In fact, we had 2 or 3 of them that simply were not like that. And they were extremely sensitive. They were extremely high maintenance. They required constant holding and soothing and all types of strategies to get them to help them regulate, because they were not good at regulating on their own. And those kids, when it came to the idea of sleep training, those two different kinds of kids, sleep training looked very, very different. Now, remember, temperament and personality is a continuum, it's a spectrum. So some kids may have elements of both being really sensitive and needing a lot of external soothing and also being very self-regulated and easygoing. And some kids fall to the extremes on either side. But when it comes to when most people get to 4 or 5 months is when, especially if people are going back to work, there becomes the discussion about a sleep schedule and sleep training. In my experience, for most babies developmentally, regardless of your temperament or personality, it's really hard to impose a sleep schedule or a sleep training regimen until between 4 and 5 months. They're just not developmentally ready to be able to self-soothe in that way and self-regulate in that way consistently, to be able to impose a schedule on them to sleep more, continuously for 6 or 7 hours through the night. And how babies then respond to that and respond to that process, no matter what the books that you read say, whether it's Baby Wise or Happiest Baby on the Block or any of those books, there's no simple hack that works or applies to every single baby, because there's so much variability in how babies respond to those different types of, of imposing a schedule or a routine. Most babies will generally fall into a routine of about 2 or 3 naps during the day and then a longer stretch overnight. Breastfeeding or bottle feeding or formula feeding will impact how that looks overnight, simply because breastfed babies will just wake more often to want to eat, and often 4, 5, 6 months will still wake up for an overnight feed at least once. But after 6 months, most babies, both breast and formula fed, will be able to sleep for 6 or 7 continuous hours and not need to eat. The other thing about this process is, I think, that parents put way too much pressure on themselves and way too much weight on the fact that somehow getting your baby into some kind of sleep training routine has some long-term developmental significance, and the truth is it simply does not. How you do sleep training can often depend on what your individual situation is. It's your work situation, it's your social situation, it's your apartment or living situation at the time, and does the baby have a place to be in a separate space, or are you limited to really just having the baby in your room? And what works for you? And the simple truth is, for a lot of families, depending on what's going on, it simply is unrealistic to think that, especially if you have a high needs or a more sensitive child, that being able to sleep train your baby and listen to them cry and go through that whole process of whichever version of that you try to do, simply for them creates way too much discomfort and anxiety, and it's simply way better and easier for them to just respond to their baby's needs, quickly get them back to sleep, and then themselves go back to sleep, even if it means waking up more, versus engaging in a very structured and formal process in whatever version of that you'd like to read about and engage in. But it involves some form of letting your baby accommodate to not being immediately soothed by you and learning how to self-soothe. And either one of those is fine, and it doesn't have any, either way, your baby will turn out happy and healthy and developmentally normal, and it doesn't impact them negatively if you choose not to sleep train, for instance. I know many families who've simply accepted the fact that it just doesn't work for them, and they simply are not interested in engaging in letting their kid cry and self-soothe at this point in time, and they simply don't want to do it. The other thing that's important to know, and I think that this is where some internet misinformation shows up, is that there is this other school of thought that sleep training your child and letting your child cry somehow emotionally harms them, or somehow creates attachment problems or attachment disorders and raises their cortisol. All that is simply untrue. A lot of the studies that try to prove that were done on children in orphanages and in situations that are not akin to a child being raised in a loving, warm household with present parents. It simply isn't true that you are emotionally harming your child if you choose to sleep train, because you want them to sleep also. So the point is that whatever choice you make with sleep training, they're both okay. And either one, your child will turn out fine. And you should do what works for you because it's working for you in the moment, knowing that you can always decide to change it and your child will be fine either way. And the next big topic that people, I think, spend a lot of time and energy on is food introduction for their infants. I'm going to also limit this discussion to the typical situation. I'm going to exclude infants that were very premature, that were in the NICU, that have either some kind of neurocognitive disability that can have lots of oral motor dysfunction, sensory problems, where learning how to eat and food introduction is a much more difficult and a much more drawn out process, and often need help with feeding therapy and other external resources. Talking more about the typical situation. Most kids between 4 and 5 months are giving parents signs that they're interested in eating. They're often staring at your food. They're often showing a lot of interest. And I think there's still a lot of mythology from the older methods that a lot of us were given back, from the last generation, about deferring or waiting an excessive amount of time to introduce babies to food. The short answer is, and the really simple answer in the typical situation, is that you want to start introducing your baby to all the foods that you eat between 4 and 5 months, or at least by 6 months, for two main reasons. One is that food functions around the immune system with regards to training the immune system properly around food, the same way that vaccines train the infant's immune system around disease. We introduce vaccines, which are basically proteins that stimulate our immune response to certain types of diseases and infection, at a very early time, to take advantage of the growth and development of the immune system, to train the immune system to recognize these diseases and fight them off. Same thing we've learned happens with food and allergies, that early introduction to food proteins and food exposure trains the immune system as the immune system develops in this window of rapid and large immune development, to respond appropriately to foods and recognize them as healthy, and it decreases allergies and allergic responses. We've been learned that early introduction of food and the widest variety of foods equates to lower rate of food allergies, specifically also to things like peanut and egg and other known allergens, seafood, things like that. So what I tell my patients simply is that there's no food that's off limits except for honey. Honey should not be given to infants until at least 12 months, because there's a risk of infant botulism. The botulism spores can often be present in honey, and a baby's immune system can not fight them off, and so overexposure to honey can cause an infant to become ill. So we simply say no honey, but we encourage families to, between 4 and 6 months, I believe around 5 months is a great time, to start including your infant in your meals and gently exposing them to all the foods that you eat. There's really no role for using infant baby cereal, which is mostly a processed carbohydrate and starch, has no nutritional value, has additives you don't want, is a processed food. There really isn't also a lot of role, other than convenience, for single ingredient processed pureed baby foods. It's simply soften or grind up the food that you're making. We always had a baby bullet, one of those little tabletop grinders, and just gently introduce your baby to the foods that you eat every day. And do it multiple times a day. Most babies will quickly catch on. Some babies will gag and have some oral sensitivity and difficulty with processing chunky food, but they often overcome that quickly. And then what a lot of people find is their child becomes a much more interested eater a lot sooner. And then the process, by the time your child is 9 to 12 months, is you have a child who's eating most of their calories from food, which is what you want them to do. There's a great website I want to introduce everyone to called the Dr. Yum Project, dryum.org, which has a huge amount of information on introducing your child to foods and a wide variety of foods, and getting your child to be a broad-based eater as early as possible. It's run by some amazing pediatricians and specialists in feeding or occupational therapy and feeding. So I highly recommend that parents look at that website. And join us for part 2, when we're going to talk about sick infants and sick babies and when to be concerned. We're also going to talk about the topic of flatheads and helmets, which also has become a really big topic. So looking forward to you joining us there. Don't forget to check us out at our website, yourkidswillbefine.com, where you can download all the episodes, leave questions and comments and suggestions for future shows. And we're looking forward to seeing you next time.